Hi, JJ here with The Art of Value. Well, it's more than 45 days since the end of the third quarter, so all the 13F filings are out. They're filings by money managers managing more than $100 million in their portfolios. So these filings give us an insight into what they've been investing in the last quarter. So in this video, I'm going to look at what they've been buying and selling in the last quarter as well. So let's get into it. First of all, let's look at what the market did during that quarter. The S&P 500, the market benchmark, was down over 6% during the quarter. As you can see on the screen, if you're watching on YouTube video or Spotify video, you'll see that for about the first half of the quarter, the market went up 12.54%, and about the second half, it went down 16.71% for that overall loss. So that's the market backdrop for these investors for buying and selling during the quarter, as it was for us as well. So let's get straight into looking at what the top buys were for these super investors during the quarter. This data is from Data Roma. After looking at the list, we'll go into each stock and see who's actually been buying and selling. So let's go through each one. First at the top of the list is Meta, which isn't surprising because it's down so much, the stock. I recently made a video about Meta for the last quarter, so I'll put a link to that in the description. Next is Microsoft Corp. Next is Amazon, Alphabet, Salesforce, Alphabet again, that's the other class of stock, Visa, Booking Holdings, PayPal Holdings, Walt Disney, Charter Communications, Micron Technology, Berkshire Hathaway, Bank of America, Adobe, Capital One, Warner Brothers, and Taiwan Semiconductor. I've also made a video about that because Berkshire Hathaway bought some of that in the last quarter as the stock plummeted. I'll link to that video about Berkshire buying Taiwan Semiconductor, so there's more detail there if you want to see it. So those were the top 18 buys from super investors in that last quarter. It's down to 18 because I wanted to include Taiwan Semiconductor there. It wasn't a huge buy for Berkshire, but still significant that they bought that tech stock, and it was down so much, and the fact that it's in Taiwan, so there's kind of Chinese politics there involved. Also interesting to me is Charter Communications at number 11. I made a video about how Michael Burry bought Charter along with two other John Malone related stocks, and I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Before I get into who bought and sold each one in a bit more detail, let's look at this list of the most owned stocks by super investors. This is overall, not just in the last quarter. Let's have a look at this. The top two are Alphabet, different classes of stock there. Then we go Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, Visa, Berkshire Hathaway, MasterCard, Wells Fargo, United Health Group, Bank of America Corp, Johnson & Johnson, Moody's, Berkshire Hathaway A-Class, Apple, Charles Schwab, and the list goes on there. If you're on video, you can see the rest on screen, but there's some similarities there of buys in the last quarter and the overall popularity of the stocks. So a lot of these investors have been adding to their positions. Now getting into each one in a bit more detail to see who bought and sold each one. This is Meta, the most bought stock for the quarter. Some names that stick out to me there is Bill Nygren from Oakmark Select Fund, bought 9.45%. Not a new position, just added to it. Thomas Gayner from Markel Asset Management. I own Markel as a company and he's the asset manager there. So it's interesting to see what he's buying every quarter. He added 7.47%. Thomas Gayner's talked about his investing strategy as being a bit like a sports team where he's got favorite players. He might like one more over time if it's playing better, so he adds to it, lets them play more, and if he loses conviction, sort of takes away. So he ends up adding a little bit a quarter or taking it away. He never really goes in big and buys huge in one go. I haven't seen him do that, at least very much. He's very much incremental in his buying, and here we see that. So the next name of interest and significant to me there is Robert Vanal. I've talked about Robert Vanal in terms of small caps on the channel, but he does also own some big caps, and his portfolio has taken a beating this year, but it's interesting to see that he's added a little bit to Meta here still. Pat Dorsey's another portfolio manager that I follow because he's got a very interesting portfolio. He's added just a little bit, 0.13% to his portfolio in the quarter. Two significant sells to me is number one, David Tepper from Appaloosa Management sold 12.5% of his holding this last quarter of Meta, and Bill Miller, who sold 16.13%. So some investors buying and some investors losing some conviction in Meta during the quarter. I'm not going to go into the fundamentals of each of these companies. I'm just going to go through these quickly. Let's just say that these are expert investors, and if they're buying, you can kind of be sure that the fundamentals are pretty sound with these companies. Having said that, I'm going to show one slide from each company, just a snapshot from Guru Focus. Don't take this as a valuation. It's not. You have to do your own due diligence on each company. This is just a very superficial look. But we have here the profitability rank 10 out of 10 for Meta, of course. For those on audio, we can see gross margin, operating margin, net margin, return on assets, and return on invested capital there. And what I like to look at is the return on capital employed, which for Meta is 23, which is well above average. And Guru Focus there is showing that Meta is currently undervalued. That's up for debate, depending on how you see the future of the company, of course. If you're getting value out of this episode, please consider liking if you're watching on YouTube to help with the algo and spread it to more people. Thanks. Next up is Microsoft at number 2, and at the top of the list of buyers we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Trust. They added 4,506% to the holding of Microsoft. We had 13 investment funds that have added to Microsoft during the quarter, so quite significant. And we have 12 that have reduced as well, so about the equal number of buys to sells there. Nothing else really jumps out in the buys there in names that I know and follow, but in the sells I can see Terry Smith from Fundsmith reduced 7.34%, and David Tepper reduced 6%. Thomas Russo also reduced 36% of his holding, but it wasn't a big percentage of his folio to begin with. Turn to the slide about the fundamentals of the company, and it's no surprise to see that the profitability rank is 10 out of 10. It's saying it's slightly undervalued there, but again, you've got to do your own work on that. And we see the gross margin, operating margin, net margin, again, all great. Gross margin 68%, operating margin 41%. These are impressive numbers. And return on capital employed 32, which is about twice the average. So, of course, we wouldn't expect Microsoft to have anything kind of less than that. That's the number 2 pick from their super investors, so we're not surprised to see those good numbers there. To be such a big buyers in the quarter, we can assume that they think it's currently undervalued, or at least fair valued during the quarter. Next up is Amazon, and some of the names that I follow and recognize there. Josh Tarasoff added, Bill Nygren added again, Bill Miller, Thomas Gayner, Terry Smith, they all added to it. And some of the significant reduction in holdings is Seth Klarman from Baupost Group, a legendary value investor, reduced by 58%, so that's interesting. David Tepper reduced 3.3%, David Tepper a seller again. And there we see Guru Focus is saying that it's significantly undervalued, and the profitability rank is 8 out of 10. It's only an indication, you've got to do your own work, assume that for all of these. There's a lot of factors that go into valuation, of course, so we certainly don't look at this number as absolute or correct. Now to Alphabet or Google, we see some of the usual suspects here for this last quarter actually. We see Josh Tarasoff again, adding 25.55%, Thomas Gayner adding 7% incrementally again. We see Bill Miller adding 0.7%, Poland Capital, Terry Smith adding just 0.10%, and who sold? We can see that Bill Nygren sold 13.4%, and again we can see pretty good numbers there for Google, of course, with 9 out of 10 profitability rank. It's saying it's a little bit undervalued. Again, take that with a grain of salt. And what's interesting to me, I always like to look at the return on capital employed, which is 27, again way above the S&P 500 average, which you would expect from Google. One of the best companies of all time, you could say. Next we have Salesforce. It's not a company that I've looked at very much at all. In fact, I like smaller companies, so I don't own any of these companies so far, and I'm not planning to. I'm looking at smaller, mid and small caps. So these big mega caps don't interest me, but they certainly interest these super investors with big funds with a lot of money to invest. Again, we see Josh Tarasoff again at over 10%. He's featured in most of these so far. And Chuck Akre again, he's just added a little bit. And Bill Nygren again bought for the first time 1.2 million shares, and Viking Global Investors bought. And in the sales, Robert Vanel reduced by 2.86%, and David Tepper reduced by 5%. Again, these investors featuring in the same stocks throughout the quarter. And for profitability rank for Salesforce is 7 out of 10, which is not surprising. And Guru Focus here is saying that it's significantly undervalued at the moment. It's not surprising that these investors picked this up if they've looked at it closely. And here we have next on the list is Alphabet again, the other class of Google shares. Chase Coleman's at the top of the list there with 140% adding. And also on the list again is Josh Tarasoff, Thomas Gayner, Bill Miller again, Terry Smith just with 0.1%. And the sales I can see there is Bill Nygren sold 13.4%. And next we have Visa, which is another popular stock with Viking Global Investors again adding 109%. Two competitors from the UK, as I understand it, Lindsay Train and Terry Smith's Fundsmith, both adding during the quarter. And not surprising again, the profitability rank is 10 out of 10 for this stock. The return on capital employed nearly 29, again way above the average, which I think is a clue as to why these super investors are interested in Visa and many of these other stocks. And so Guru Focus here is saying that it's modestly undervalued. So again, not surprising that these super investors have picked up Visa during this quarter. I must say that I looked at some of these about a year and a half ago, and they were certainly not listed as undervalued then. The market has been going down this year, of course, the reason that they've slipped into this territory. But again, a grain of salt as to whether they are undervalued or not. Depends on a lot of factors. Do your own work. Can't say that enough. Next up is Booking Holdings, which I've seen a couple of write-ups from value investors over the last few years, so I'm actually not surprised to see this on the list. In terms of the buys and sells, we see John Armitage, who I don't really know, at the top of the list, who added 91%. In the reduction, Bill Nygren sold 100%, so sold out of Booking Holdings. And for Booking, we see the profitability rank is 8 out of 10 here, and it's actually listed as a value trap. Think twice. One thing that put me off from this company when I looked at it briefly was the huge amount of goodwill on the balance sheet after making a lot of acquisitions. Didn't really like to see that. Next up is PayPal, which has dropped a huge amount this year, so I suppose it's not surprising to see it on this list. We see Thomas Gayner's added 55%, but it's not a huge part of his portfolio yet. And Lindsay Train, again from the UK, added just 1.47% of their portfolio. Pat Dorsey, Terry Smith's Fundsmith, reduced by 41.86%, which is quite a big reduction, so must have lost conviction in the stock there. And we see the profitability rank for PayPal is 9 out of 10, and Guru Focus is saying it's significantly undervalued. And if you're looking at the video, you can see just how much on that graph there. But it's interesting to see. I haven't looked in depth at PayPal at all, again, because it's too big of a company for me. But the return on capital employed says 9.9, which is actually not above average. So it'd be interesting to dig deeper into this and to find out if that's actually the case. And the return on invested capital, 12.78. Gross margin of 50, operating margin of 14. But it is a significantly popular stock this past quarter for super investors. Next up is media and entertainment giant Disney. You might have seen in the news in just the last couple of weeks a CEO change. We see that Christopher Bloomstrang bought it, added 2.1%. He's a Berkshire Hathaway expert. He's done a lot of analysis on Berkshire. Berkshire is one of his biggest investments. Thomas Gayner again, Pat Dorsey bought, Lindsay Train sold, Thomas Russo sold, and David Tepper sold 100%, sold out of Disney. It's going to be interesting to see the next quarter, these buys and sells, given what's happening at the company at the moment. And just a quick look at Guru Focus tells us the profitability rank is 8 out of 10, and it says it's significantly undervalued. Again, with a grain of salt, and you can see some of the quick metrics there for the company if you want to on screen. And now to Charter Communications. As I said, I made a video about Michael Burry's buys last quarter, and he bought into Charter Communications, a John Malone company, along with other two companies. And Guru Focus gives us a profitability rank of 8 out of 10, and it says it's a value trap. Think twice, which is a grain of salt again. You have to look deeply into this. Obviously, Michael Burry thinks it's a good buy. These companies, John Malone companies, tend to have a lot of debt the way it's structured, so that puts me off completely, but Burry obviously sees something in it, and there's something complicated going on here in between the companies with John Malone, but I don't know what. And now to Micron Technologies, which I've talked about a lot here on the channel because I own it as a stock, and a lot of super investors do too. And this quarter we can see that Prem Watts, a legendary value investor, bought it 399%. He added 3.19% of the portfolio. Also Seth Klarman from Baupost Group, another legendary value investor, wrote that book Margin of Safety, which is good, added 268%, so quite a big add there, although it's only 0.92% of the portfolio. But David Tepper from Appaloosa Management sold out 100%. It was 2% of the portfolio. He's out. So those are the top 12 super investor buys for this past quarter. If you got value out of this episode, please consider subscribing if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're in your favorite podcast app, subscribe or follow, whatever it allows you to do. And I'll see you next time.